Welcome to this Bone Matters session on nutrition and bone health. Now, we know this is such a popular topic with our audience. You really want to know what you need to eat and drink to help your bone strength. And we do read so many things in the media about what's good and what's bad. And it's very confusing. And we don't know whether changing what we eat will make a difference to our risk of breaking a bone in the future. So I'm privileged today to be joined by an expert in the field, someone who has devoted much of her working life to this topic and who's given continuous support and advice to us at the Royal Osteoporosis Society. So I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Sue Lanham-New. Lovely to be talking with you again, Sue, and welcome. And perhaps we could just start by you introducing yourself. Is that okay? Just saying about your job and your special research interests.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Sarah. And it's always a pleasure to give the up-to-date information of where we are for nutrition and bone. So as Sarah said, my name is Susan Lanham-New. I'm head of the Department of Nutrition, Food and Exercise Sciences at the University of Surrey, and I'm also Professor of Human Nutrition there, and I have worked extensively in the field of nutrition and bone over the last 30 years.
Thank you. And in this discussion, I'm going to be posing some of those common type questions that we cover in many of our information resources and really ask for a bit of an update. Has research got any new insights, any positive lifestyle changes in terms of nutrition that we should really be thinking about? And my first question is a really broad one. Does what we eat and drink really make a difference to our bone health and our risk of breaking bones? Any kind of broad comment you'd like to make at the beginning?
Yes, definitely, Sarah. That's a great question, and is one that always comes up, actually, is, does it really matter? And my answer to that would be severalfold. Number one, yes, it does really matter in terms of from the concept of you are what you eat. And I think, where we can ensure that our bodies are getting key nutrients, such as calcium, such as vitamin D, and many other nutrients that we know are important to bone. But I think we are limited in our information because we don't have enough research. What we lack are very strong, what we would call randomized controlled trials that are hypothesis proving for many nutrients for us to make as important a claim as what we would like to make. So for many aspects, it hasn't been proven. But I think following those concepts of the Eat Well guide, so following a balanced diet that is, full of many different foods and food groups, and if you choose to exclude a specific food group, that you're very clear of those nutrients that you will try and make up in other food groups. But bearing in mind that the power of nutrition is not as good, certainly in terms of fracture prevention, as the current clinical guidance that we have. I wished I could say that if you follow this diet, you won't get osteoporosis, but it's not that simple. It's multifactorial, but certainly following a balanced diet that's got all of those nutrients will be important to your health overall, but will be important to the health of your bones, whether you're younger or whether you're older.
That's a great introduction. Thank you, Sue. And I'm now going to go on to those kind of specific topics, which sound very detailed, but we do get questions. So the first one I know is quite a complicated one, which is this thing called a high acidity diet. So a diet being too acidic. And I know that is not about oranges and lemons, but it's complicated. So I wondered, could you just give us a little quick explanation of what is this acidic diet and whether it is a problem for our bones? And then we can perhaps go on to talk about ways of approaching it.
So what it comes down to is aspect that is called your acid-base balance. So you've got, when your body, so we have a metabolism such that our blood pH, so if you were to measure somebody's blood pH, it would be very tightly controlled at about 7.4, a pH of 7.4. And what we know is that people can develop what we would call mild metabolic acidosis, where they would become a little bit more acidic than what we would want them to be. And what the body has are very careful mechanisms to try to make sure that we maintain that acid alkali balance within our bodies. And what we know is that if you follow a particular diet, for example, that is full of more what we would call acid producing foods, and so really that is the majority of foods actually fall within that component. Many people think when you talk about acidic foods, you're only talking about meats, for example, but actually whole grains can be acidic or are acidic. The only real foods that are alkali are your fruits and vegetables. And so many people quite understandably get confused that, so for example, citrus fruits, because they contain citric acid, you would think that they are acidic, but when they're actually metabolized by the body, it's the citrate salts that would give them that dietary alkalinity. So, all your citrus fruits would be in the alkali category. So what we would say in diet in general, and that matches completely the Eat Well guide, is to try to have a very good proportion of fruits and vegetables within your diets. Actually, be careful not to eat too much fruit, of course, because they are very high in sugar content. Nonetheless, they provide a great balance of vitamins and minerals within them, but always err probably more on the vegetable side if you can, because you have much less sugar content in vegetables than what you do in fruit. And so it's just, when you look at that, there is evidence within the bone field to say that dietary acidity, if you look at that, has been associated with a higher bone loss and a lower bone density in different population groups. But we have yet to see published, Sarah, enough randomized controlled trials, because those, of course, are so tight in their rigor, that really gives us that conclusive evidence.
That's great. So lots of detail there. So go for that really well-balanced diet with plenty of fruit and vegetables, and that should make sure everything's in balance. Is that a good conclusion, really?
That's spot on, Sarah. And I think what's very interesting is that when you look at the trials that have been done, the Mediterranean diet, which is, of course, as we would well know, is very high in fruits and vegetables. The DASH diet, now that was the dietary approaches to stopping hypertension when it was originally set up. That was exactly a study that was trying to reduce blood pressure. But what they showed was that they had a huge reduction in urinary calcium. So the amount of calcium that was being lost in the urine was very favourable. Nothing, of course, to do with bone. And so DASH, again, very similar to the Mediterranean, it follows a balanced diet, but with plenty of fruits and vegetables in there. So when you look at it epidemiologically, i.e. you're looking at what populations eat, it would show a very nice pattern that actually there have been studies that across the board, where you look at where there is a high fruit and vegetable component, then many of those population groups do have a better bone density. We just don't have enough trials that have really looked at bone as their end points.
That's very reassuring, and thank you for laying all that out. So let's go on to another big topic, and this is very much a topic of the moment. We all know a little about the microbiome, and we hear about it in relation to health generally. So I suppose I think our audience would like to know, well, what is this microbiome, and does it make a difference to our bones? I suppose that's the overarching question. So anything you can tell us?
Oh, definitely. And I mean, I think, again, it really goes to the pattern of a healthy diet. So basically, within our bodies, and we have is what we would call gut bacteria. And what we're trying, what is beginning to come out from many different studies, is that the gut microbiome, so how your gut is lined, if you like, with good bacteria, how important that is for health. And it is certainly something that I think will grow and grow over time. But from a bone point of view, many of the early studies that were done, of course, as is often the case in science, they are done in animal models, and we then look to see, does that replicate itself in humans? And of course, what you can do is you can buy probiotics or prebiotics that you can take as a supplement, or you can get through sources of fermented drinks. There are some trials that have looked very promising for bone, that we tend to exhibit. The trouble is we just don't have enough of them. But of those that are there, I think there are three aspects. Those trials that have looked at supplementing a group with pre or probiotics as a supplement that you can buy, so that is made of what we would call a healthy bacteria, by giving that in the diet as part of giving it actually as a supplement, it did show a reduction in osteoclastic activity, so that's your bone resorbing cells, and in several of the trials showed an increase in bone density. What it's also shown is that giving this healthy bacteria helps increases the amount of calcium that is absorbed by the gut, and also the amount of vitamin D that has been absorbed. So the trials that have been done have shown there to be an increase in the amount of vitamin D that is circulating. So it points to really trying to follow a diet, I think, which is reflective of helping the body to keep a healthy gut bacteria environment. And again, if you look at that, it follows that pattern of that Eat Well guide, particularly in terms of fruits and vegetables. Now, I've summarised something there, Sarah, over about 30 years worth, but that is where we're at the moment. So anything that you can do to encourage your gut to be in a healthy environment, that would be consuming your whole grains, making sure that your body has, a good intestinal absorption, making sure that, that you're not constipated, making sure that you've got plenty of fibre in your diet. And we know that populations in Western worlds in particular, so the UK, in other areas, Europe, North America, where we see that we aren't eating enough fibre in our diets, that of course is not good for, our digestive system. And that all plays into, a healthy gut microbiota, where you've got plenty of fibre-rich foods in there, which includes your whole grains, that includes your fruits and vegetables, your fermented milk products in there, because they contain this gut microbiota. And certainly, when we look at it, Sarah, I mean, this is a little bit left field, but I think when you look at it, where for example, if we get sick and we take antibiotics, then of course it's looking at trying to make sure that once that infection has gone, that we're then trying to work really hard to get the good bacteria back into our intestinal absorption.
That's really interesting. So it's quite exciting, isn't it, the work that's going on in that field? And what you're saying is pretty positive. Just make sure, again, fruit and vegetables, fibre, possibly the fermented foods, and maybe even the probiotic supplements. But I guess we just need more research, don't we, to get the final answers?
Yes, we do. And I would say, supplements, of course, can be very expensive. And I think what's important is that we try to achieve, I mean, food's expensive enough, isn't it? You know, without adding supplements into it. But I think we are a long way from saying that everybody should start taking, you know, a supplement of pre or probiotics. We've got to do a lot more experimental work and just try to encourage people to just eat as healthily as what they can, and spend, you know, in this era of such a huge issue of cost of living when food is so expensive, is to try to achieve all those aspects that I have said through your diet. And, you know, we shouldn't be popping pills. I think the only exception to that, of course, is vitamin D in the winter, unless you're eating very high foods that are very high in vitamin D, like your oily fishes. That, of course, the government recommendation is that 10 micrograms, 400 international units, October to March, when you won't be getting any sunlight exposure. That really is the only exception in terms of a supplement. Everything else, if you eat a balanced diet, you should be able to get it in there.
Yeah, that's great. And that takes me on actually to my next topic, which was calcium and vitamin D, which over the years people think is the focus, but we know it's bigger than that. But I was going to say anything new, and obviously you've explained about the shift a bit towards vitamin D supplementation, but is there anything new in terms perhaps of calcium or and indeed vitamin D over the last few years that you think is worth a mention?
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up, because of course I think I can answer that in several ways. Number one, 99% of our total body calcium is contained within our bones and teeth. And so we've always looked to calcium as being the number one nutrient for bone. And I think it certainly remains the case that what you must avoid is being below dietary requirements. RNI is, of course, 700 milligrams, so try to be at that level. And indeed, the guidance has always been, and I think that remains, that from a osteoporosis point of view, to maybe even be at 1,000 milligrams per day. So trying to ensure that your dietary intake of calcium, you know, is at those levels. So I don't think there's really any new trials to question that, Sarah. Obviously, there have been trials to show that there's not necessarily any effect with a higher calcium intake, but not trials to show that it's detrimental. It might be in some individuals, and we know that we're all different. And I think, Sarah, in addition to the gut microbiome work coming, I think the other area is, of course, gene nutrient interactions, that if you're genetically predisposed to a particular condition, you may have a higher requirement for a particular nutrient. I think we need a lot more research before we can really give targeted advice, but certainly making sure that your calcium levels are sufficient in your diet, following those recommendations that I've said. And then the same with vitamin D. I think it is what's important for vitamin D. When you said there, Sarah, have there been any new trials? There have been some that have looked to say that vitamin D supplements don't prevent fracture, and some of those have found their way into the media. But it's very important to point out that those trials that have been done, so what happens is we do randomized controlled trials, and then we pull them together in what's called meta-analyses. So the strength of a meta-analysis is that you're pulling together, you know, more than one trial. And there have been some meta-analyses that have been published to say that actually vitamin D doesn't prevent fracture. But when you look at the baseline measurements of vitamin D status in the individuals who've gone into their trials, they're already vitamin replete. They've already been recruited into the trial and already have enough vitamin D. When you look at the trials overall for vitamin D supplementation, is avoiding deficiency is very important. So what we're trying to achieve for the population is, currently in the United Kingdom, taking 10 micrograms or 400 international units will stop you from being deficient in vitamin D.
Yeah, no, that's a really good summary. Thank you. And again, it's back to, isn't it, making sure that you're not low in anything, but not necessarily taking too much. So I think that's really
and I
useful.
think that's very important for vitamin D. Just to cut in there, Sarah, sorry, I didn't mean to stop you short, is what's very important is vitamin D, of course, is fat soluble, so it is stored. So be careful not to, there is a lot of encouragement to take very, very high levels. And I think it's really, the evidence doesn't bear that out. And if you look at the trials that worked, they were low dose on a daily basis. And that is, it points to one of balance. And of course, not forgetting that in areas of northern latitude, making sure that April to September, you get some vitamin D, safe vitamin D, through your UV light exposure. If there is any risk of skin cancer or any history of it, of course, avoid the sun. Don't ever let your skin burn, because that will never be good. And you wouldn't get a higher amount of vitamin D anyway, because the body is so clever. You can never become toxic through UV exposure, because your body cuts off after about 20 minutes. You wouldn't make any more vitamin D for that day. So it's one of balance, and it's just all the time thinking of your diet. Is it, am I getting a little bit of everything? And have I got it in the right balance? And, try to make sure that if you can eat, if you like fish, then have that, because that's very high in vitamin D. But during those winter months, think about your supplement. And where those trials haven't shown a benefit of vitamin D in fracture, you've got to look at those trials and not say that vitamin D doesn't work, because we know it's important to musculoskeletal health. Children who don't have enough vitamin D get rickets, adults get osteomalacia, but the trials that have been done, because of course we would not be allowed now in ethics studies for trials to be run on people who are deficient.
No, that's helpful. And just one quick word, because I think it's been great, that message about the vitamin D dose in a sort of healthy population. Just a message to anyone who's perhaps on a slightly higher dose for some medical reason, then that sort of steps outside of what you're saying, doesn't it? We sometimes hear people who worry, but I think there will be people on higher doses for different reasons. So any queries, check that out with your doctor.
Yes, and we know that, across the board, the safe upper limit of vitamin D is 4,000 international units per day. So you can take 10 times the recommendation that is currently given and be within those safe limits. And absolutely, and I'm sorry, I forgot to say that, Sarah, that for some bone medication, you would be prescribed calcium and vitamin D, because the trials were done with those. And that is, absolutely important to follow those guidelines. That's that which is set. That 10 micrograms is just in the general population, not specific to those with osteoporosis or indeed osteopenia.
Yeah, that's great. So let's move into a completely different area, though I don't think there'll be too much to say, and that's salt. Now, we know that there's potentially a way that salt has an impact on bone, or at least on calcium and so on. But anything new there in terms of, do people have to worry about salt in terms of their bones?
Well, there's been some very interesting work on salt. The bottom line, and I can sum it up quickly, is avoid high salt intakes. It's not good for blood pressure, and we know that conclusively in the field. But we know that if you have a high salt intake, you're likely to have a higher increase of calcium in your urine. So you will lose more calcium in your urine, which we don't want you to be doing. So try to limit your salt, either that which you add to the table or in consuming salty foods. There have been some trials to say that higher salt intake results in higher bone resorption. That has not been shown conclusively and consistently, because some people handle salt better than others. But bottom line, keep salt to a minimum.
Okay, that's great. So let's move back a bit to this sort of micronutrient idea, the idea that we need to get all these different nutrients to get what our bones need. And I think I've heard about eating different coloured fruit and vegetables being a way to check you're doing that. But we do get lots of questions about specific nutrients. So people ask about things like magnesium, particularly. Do I need to be balancing magnesium if I'm taking calcium and so on? Anything new? Because I know you've worked in that area. Any new insight in terms of magnesium?
Well, it's a very interesting one. I think magnesium is a bit of a special nutrient. I don't think we've paid as much attention to it as perhaps as what we should have done as a field. One of the reasons for that is it is extraordinarily difficult to measure accurately somebody's magnesium status. For vitamin D, you can measure it through a blood sample. Calcium, of course, is homeostatically controlled, so serum calcium is not a measure of the amount of calcium that you have, because the body regulates it a bit like what we do with blood pH. And so the best way of looking at calcium levels, of course, in the body is through measuring your bone density. For magnesium, magnesium is part of the hydroxyapatite, which is, of course, gives our bones that mineral structure. And if you look at the trials that have been done, the observational trials, so remember those are the trials where we're just measuring magnesium intake, for example, in the diet, and measuring bone density, we do see quite a few trials that show, the higher the magnesium intake, the higher the bone density, but they are only observational, so they are only hypothesis generating, because they're open to confounding in their type of study design. There have been a few trials that have looked at supplementing magnesium. The jury is still out. I think some have showed a benefit, some haven't shown any effect. So I would honestly say, as it currently stands, the recommendation is not for a higher magnesium intake than what you would see in a balanced diet. As it currently stands, we need more trials.
Thank you. That's great. And so not a lot has changed, but again, it's an interesting area, isn't it? Let's move on to vitamin A, Sue. So we know that potentially too much vitamin A in a certain format could be not so good for bones. Anything you want to just add in, maybe a word or two about that, and any new advice on that, any new studies?
Yes, I mean, vitamin A, of course, it's a very important nutrient for us, and we've tended, in times past, thought of it in terms of individuals not getting enough. And that has long changed, because vitamin A, you've got your retinol and your beta carotene, and so it's thinking about that in its totality. By and large, people get more than enough vitamin A in their diets. Where I think it has the potential, there were two trials, one in America and one in Sweden, that showed that people who were consuming high levels of vitamin A were at greater risk of osteoporotic fracture. There haven't been enough trials that have been published as a follow-up to that. But I think just a word of caution that if you love your, a very big source of retinol, of course, in the diet is liver. So if you really like eating your liver and bacon, that's always something that's gone together, hasn't it? If you are a very high liver consumer, then just be careful that you're not taking up too much vitamin A in your diet. And if you use cod liver oil, of course, cod liver oil, which is fantastic from many different points of view, not least, of course, it provides vitamin D and it provides all those important, fish oils. But what's very important to bear in mind is that cod liver oil is extracted from the liver of the cod. So it's going to be very high in vitamin A. So it's just, again, one of caution, just looking at that diet and making sure that you're not overdosing and having too much vitamin A.
And just a quick mention again about that difference between the vitamin A that you don't need to worry about. So perhaps if you just quickly explain that again. Just
so
to be clear.
Your beta carotene is what you would get your vitamin A in your different fruits and vegetables. So, for example, carrots are a huge supplier, and that is very different to the retinol, which is, of course, what you would find in liver products.
Yeah, that's great. Nice distinction, I think, just to be sure. So back to another topic which we used to hear more about, anything new, and that's coffee. Now, we know there were some studies early on that linked high levels of intakes of coffee with breaking bones. Anything new at all in this area, do you think?
No, I don't. I think there has been, no new comprehensive trials. Those just to reaffirm that which you so helpfully said there, Sarah, there were a couple of trials that came out that very high coffee drinkers, very strong black coffees were associated. These were, again, epidemiological studies. These were not randomized controlled trials, but they captured, all the media attention.
Yeah.
But they were individuals right at the very high level, and it was very strong black coffee. That hasn't been repeated or replicated, in randomized controlled trials. Of course, I think, again, it comes back down to one of balance. A cup of tea, a cup of coffee, taken during your day is something that people really enjoy. You often have milk with that, so that's great because that gives a very nice balance, whether it is, cow's milk or whether it is your plant-based milks. And of course, let's not forget to say that you can achieve a high calcium intake without taking your milk and dairy products, but you've just got to pay particular attention to those other products that will provide that. But the evidence, certainly in a lab, that if you give very high caffeine intakes, you will see an increase in urinary calcium excretion. But that's at the very high levels. And I think it's one of balance, not having too much in your diet. I think the studies that were done, they've never been repeated, or people haven't found the same thing, but these were individuals who were drinking strong black coffee. I think it was about 10 or 12 cups per day. I mean, these were very high consumers.
That's great. And we hear about tea. Obviously, tea does have caffeine in, but we do get studies every now and then that tell us that things like green tea are very rich in flavonoids and other things. Would you say there's anything around tea that might be better for bones? Or again, are you just saying there isn't really enough evidence either way?
No, nowhere near enough evidence. And the trials that have looked at, your isoflavones, of course, which are in different green teas, etc., those have been in very concentrated levels and not the sorts of levels that you would get in tea. Mechanistically, I think they're very exciting, but again, we need a lot more evidence for us to be able to make, any substantial claims.
Great. So many topics here, Sue, and I realise we haven't got a lot of time, but I do want to cover a few more things. Fasting is very much a topic of attention at the moment. Any evidence that fasting in any way might be good for bones? Any research around that?
Not really. I think it's an interesting one. And if you look at the population that lives the longest in the world, it is Japan. And, the Japanese, whilst I don't know about Japanese culture, but I know I have seen a lot of the trials about fasting have come out of Japan. But I think really from a bone point of view, the trials just haven't been done. I think it's interesting from a health point of view. There has been quite a lot of interest in it, but I think certainly from a bone point of view, there's no substantial evidence to say that will either help or hinder bones. What I think is key is trying to, as we've said, keep a healthy body weight, try to encourage that healthy, balanced diet, and fasting may or may not come in times to come, but I think the jury is still a long way off from making any conclusions from a bone point of view.
Thank you. What about B vitamins? We hear a bit about B vitamins. Any new research there at all and their role?
Yes, I mean, I think, again, mechanistically, we consider the B vitamins to be very important for bone health. Very few trials that have been done, and I think we need much more evidence on those randomized control trials. So those very tight studies that really look at that nutrient in isolation, and when it's given as a supplement, does it improve? There have been some trials to show a reduction in osteoclastic activity, but nowhere near enough for us to have as a recommendation that you should be having this much vitamin B over and above what you would get in a healthy, balanced diet.
Thank you. So the next topic was protein, and obviously you've talked about the acidic diet, and so we don't need to go on to that again. But and also I'm aware there have been studies concerned that older people may be at risk of hip fracture if they don't get enough protein. Just wondered if any comment there. Do we need to pay attention specifically to protein for bones in any way, do you think? Maybe vegans, I think, or there was the other group that we wondered whether needed a mention.
I mean, by and large, as a population, we eat far more protein than what is actually recommended in the diet, because so many foods contain protein. What's key is twofold, is as we get older, we want to try and ensure that as appetite decreases and we tend to eat slightly less food, that you're still keeping that dietary quality within your diet, that you are still having good quality protein, either from an animal source, like your meat or your fish, or from, if you are a vegetarian or a vegan, that you're getting your protein from other sources, like your dairy products if you're vegetarian, or if you're a vegan, through your whole grains and your pulses and your beans, and you've got those in the right combination. We do see some evidence to say that vegans, certainly some of the epidemiological studies have shown that vegans, certainly EPIC, the European Prospective Instance on Cancer, EPIC trials, that have shown the potential that vegans may be more at risk of fracture as they get a bit older if that quality of the diet in terms of its protein content. That is not randomized control trials, those are epidemiological studies, and of course we have to treat those types of trials with a little bit of caution because you're not able to control for everything. So I think it's one of balance, that as we get older, try to ensure that you have got, when you sit down to eat, that there is you have a quality in your diet of good protein. And then secondly, if you are a vegan, it's not so much of an issue if you're vegetarian, because you will have, you'll be probably a lacto-ovo vegetarian where you'll have your dairy and your eggs. But if you are a very strict vegan, then just making sure that you've got plenty of good quality protein within your diet.
Thank you. And just a quick mention here in terms of plant-based diets. Anything you want to add about non-dairy milks? Because a lot of people are choosing to have plant milks, which, as you say, many of them are supplemented with calcium. Anything else? Do people, is that fine to have a plant milk? Yeah. Plant
milk, I think just check on the label, make sure, because plant milk, so cow's milk is naturally high in calcium. That is, it's not added in, it's naturally there, and it's there with other nutrients. So it is a tremendously healthy product from that point of view. There's been a lot of debate about, the dairy and dietary fat. Actually, semi-skimmed and skimmed products contain more calcium than your full fat, because the calcium is contained in the non-cream portion. So I've seen it said in the media before that skimmed and semi-skimmed products are very low on calcium. That's simply not true. They're slightly higher in calcium, not much different, but they're certainly not low on calcium content. Indeed, they're slightly higher per 100 grams because of that. What I would say is if you're following a plant-based diet, if you're taking your plant-based milks, it's perfectly possible to get a good calcium intake into your diet. Your nuts, your seeds, your green leafy vegetables, all of those are providers of calcium. But just check on your plant milks. Most of them are fortified with calcium. If they're not, choose an alternative, a plant milk that has got calcium added into it. And there have been studies to show that those plant-based milks, your body absorbs the calcium just as effectively as what you would have in cow's milk.
Great. Well, it's a nice positive message to end on. We're nearly through. And I was going to say, well, I think I know what you're going to say here. Where would you like to see more research? But I guess that's a big question.
Probably the most important one in terms of future research would be the gut microbiome, because if we can try and come up, because I think one of the issues that I've told when I go around to all the local groups, and it's such an honour to come and talk to local groups, because you're the very people for whom we do our research on, and you're always also inspiring with the questions that you ask. If there's one thing that comes out, Sarah, is people struggle with their digestion as they get older. And that would be linked to your gut microbiome, no doubt about it. We need a lot more research as to whether pre and probiotics, how helpful they are to you, if indeed they are. And I think the jury, there's still an awful lot more work to do on that. And helping you, absorb, where if you are taking a bone medication, that we can really try within the field of nutritional sciences, help your bodies digest food better as you're getting older, because that is all comes back down to the gut microbiome, but not in any way forgetting, micronutrients that we know are important for health across the board.
Well, thank you. That's been brilliant, Susan. And we learned so much, and it's been great to update, and a nice positive message to end on as well. So thank you. And we will be signposting you to lots of other resources that we've mentioned during this film. So have a look alongside it. So just leaves me to say thank you very much, Sue, and thank you all for listening, and goodbye.